When I arrived at my daughter's house, she was cradling her crying baby with one arm while struggling through a mountain of dirty dishes with the other. Then I noticed something that made my heart sink, and I knew I couldn't stay silent another second. "There's one more thing about that mountain you don't know yet, Mr. Whitaker," General Vance had said, low enough that only my father and I could hear it. "Someone in this room tonight already knew exactly who pulled that hatch off the bus, and they've spent 14 years making sure you never found out why it mattered to them." He'd looked directly at Conrad Langley when he said it. I watched Conrad's face in that half second before he composed himself again, and I understood, with the particular cold clarity that only comes once in a lifetime, that I was looking at the face of a man who had just been told his own execution date, not fear of losing a contract. Fear of something older, something buried under 12 feet of snow for 14 years and never properly dug out. My father didn't catch it. He was still staring at the tin box in his hands, still absorbing the fact that a general had just knelt on a hardwood floor for him. I caught it. I have spent 3 years learning to read every flicker that crosses a Langley face, the way you learn to read weather before a storm, and what crossed Conrad's face in that instant wasn't guilt over a broken engagement. It was the specific animal terror of a man who thought his secret had died on a mountain 14 years ago and had just watched it walk back into the room wearing a rusted charcoal suit. I didn't say anything that night. I let the party happen. I let my father drink cheap beer with a general who had waited 14 years to say thank you. Trevor called me 2 days later. I almost didn't answer. Some old, stubborn part of me picked up anyway. Maybe out of curiosity. Maybe just to hear how low he'd sunk since the applause stopped. "You need to let this go, Bryn," he said. "No hello," his voice stripped of the smooth performance quality it always used to carry. "Whatever you think you heard the general say, it's nothing. Old business. It has nothing to do with you or your father." "Then why do you sound scared, Trevor?" There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I could hear him breathing, unsteady, in a way I'd never once heard from him in 3 years of dating. "My father built this family's entire business," Trevor finally said. "If you go digging around in something you don't understand, you're not just going to hurt him. You'll hurt me. You'll hurt my mother. Is that really what you want? After everything?" "After everything," I repeated, letting the words sit there between us like a verdict. "You slapped a rusted tin box out of my father's hands in front of 120 people, Trevor. You don't get to ask me what I want anymore." He hung up first this time. It felt, oddly, like the first genuine victory of the entire ordeal, small and quiet as it was. But I found Owen Brisbane's name 3 days later. And after that, nothing about my life went back to being simple. I'd grown up hearing about the Cascade Pass storm the way everyone in eastern Washington grows up hearing about it, as a kind of regional myth. The year the mountain nearly swallowed a highway crew and a National Guard convoy in the same week. I'd never once connected it to my father beyond the story he'd just told at my own almost wedding. I certainly never connected it to Langley Civic Development, whose glass and steel headquarters downtown I'd walked past 100 times without a second thought. Owen Brisbane had spent 22 years with the Washington State Department of Transportation's Avalanche Safety Division before retiring the year before I was born into all of this mess. Griffin Wexler, a licensed private investigator I found through a bar association referral because I didn't know a single other way to start looking into a man's history, ran his name down within 2 days. Mr. Brisbane worked the Cascade Pass corridor for most of his career, Griffin told me over the phone, his voice carrying the flat, unhurried patience of a man who'd clearly done 100 worse favors than this one for 100 more difficult clients. He filed for early retirement 6 months after the avalanche your father was involved in. Public record shows a routine pension separation. Nothing flagged. But I found something odd in an old court filing search. He was named briefly as a witness in a sealed civil matter that never went anywhere. Filed, then withdrawn 11 days later. Withdrawn by who? By the plaintiff's own attorney, Griffin said, which usually means somebody got paid to stop talking. I drove out to Owen Brisbane's house myself, a modest rambler 40 minutes outside Spokane with a wheelchair ramp built into the porch and a Washington State dot retirement plaque hanging crooked by the front door. He didn't want to let me in at first. He stood in the doorway with the specific stillness of a man who has spent 14 years hoping nobody would ever come asking. "I know who your father is," he said, before I'd even finished introducing myself. I recognized the name the second the local news picked up the story about the general and the wedding. "I've been waiting for someone to knock on this door for 14 years, Miss Whitaker. I just always thought it'd be a lawyer, not a bride in the aftermath of her own humiliation." He let me in. He made tea he didn't drink. And then slowly, in the flat, resigned voice of a man finally setting down something heavy he'd carried too long, he told me what he'd spent 14 years not telling anyone. The avalanche mitigation barriers on that stretch of the Cascade Pass were installed 2 years before the storm, Owen said. Langley Civic Development held the state contract. I was the DOT engineer assigned to inspect the final work, and I flagged it. I flagged it in writing 3 separate times that the rebar reinforcement in the upper retaining structure was undersized against the specifications in their own submitted engineering plans. Cutting corners. Standard cost-saving move on a project nobody expected to ever get tested by a real slide. "And then it got tested," I said. "And then it got tested," Owen said, "by the worst storm that mountain had seen in 3 decades. The barrier didn't just fail to hold the slide. It failed in a way that redirected and amplified it, sending twice the volume of snow and rock directly onto the roadway where that transport bus was parked, instead of diverting it into the containment basin it was engineered to fill. Your father didn't just dig soldiers out of an ordinary avalanche, Miss Whitaker. He dug them out of an avalanche that was worse, specifically because Langley Civic Development department built a barrier that failed exactly the way I told them it would. My stomach dropped the way it had the moment I saw the pale indentation where my father's wedding ring used to sit. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Owen's jaw tightened. "I did. I filed the report. Then a company representative visited my supervisor. Then my supervisor told me the report had administrative deficiencies and needed to be refiled. Then I was quietly informed that a wrongful termination lawsuit against the department, filed by a family that lost someone that same night on that same stretch of road, had reached a private settlement that included my own separation agreement. I signed it. I took the pension. I have hated myself in one form or another every day since." "Someone died," I said, the words landing heavier than I expected them to. "A young DOT plow operator named Wesley Marsh," Owen said. "He was working the same stretch of the pass that night, trying to clear the road ahead of a military convoy nobody outside the department even knew was coming through until the storm hit. He was caught in the same secondary slide that nearly buried your father's excavator. He didn't have anyone digging him out in time. I drove home that night with both hands locked on the steering wheel to keep them from shaking, and I understood, with total clarity, exactly why Conrad Langley had looked like a dying man the moment General Vance said my father's name out loud in front of a room full of witnesses. I found Wesley Marsh's widow, Estelle, through the same county obituary archive Owen had once used to bury his own report. She'd remarried, moved 20 miles east, and hadn't spoken publicly about her first husband's death in over a decade. She agreed to meet me at a diner off Highway 2, and she brought, unprompted, a manila folder of her own that she'd apparently kept in a fireproof safe since the year Wesley died. "The department told me it was an act of God," Estelle said, sliding the folder across the table. "A tragic, unavoidable accident. I believed them for years because I had a 4-year-old daughter and no money for a lawyer who'd probably lose anyway. I only stopped believing them when a woman named Renata called me 6 years ago, sobbing, saying she used to work in Langley's engineering department and needed to tell someone the truth before she lost her nerve again." "Did she tell you anything specific?" "She told me there was a name for what they did to reports like Owen Brisbane's," Estelle said. "She called it resubmission until compliance. She said engineers kept submitting corrected numbers until the ones that got approved matched the budget the client wanted, not the slope math the mountain actually needed. She said it happened on more than one project. She was terrified. She hung up before I could ask her last name. I called Owen Brisbane back that same night and asked if the name Renata meant anything to him. "Renata Okonkwo," he said immediately, no hesitation at all. "Junior structural engineer, Langley's in-house team." She was the one who actually caught my flagged numbers getting quietly revised upward in the final submission packet, after I'd already signed off on my original inspection notes. She came to me in tears the week before my separation agreement. I told her to keep her head down and get out while she still had a career left to save. I've regretted that advice every year since. Renata Okonkwo was not hard to find once I had her full name. She'd left Langley Civic Development 11 years earlier, and now taught structural engineering fundamentals at a community college in Tacoma, 200 miles from anyone who might recognize her, from a company she'd spent a decade trying to forget she'd ever worked for. She agreed to meet me only after I told her, plainly, that Amos Whitaker was my father, and that a general had knelt on a hardwood floor in front of him 3 weeks earlier. "I read about the wedding," she said, when we finally sat across from each other in her cramped faculty office, a space lined with unmarked stacks of student essays she clearly hadn't graded in weeks. "I recognized Conrad Langley's name in the article before I even got to the part about your father. I actually laughed out loud, alone in this office, which probably says something concerning about where my head still is 14 years later. I need you to tell me what you know," I said. "Not for revenge. For Wesley Marsh's daughter, who's 22 years old now and still thinks her father's death was just bad luck." Renata was quiet for a long moment, turning a chipped ceramic mug in slow circles on her desk. "I have the original engineering submission," she finally said. "The real one, with Owen Brisbane's flagged rebar specifications still intact, time-stamped 3 days before the version that actually got filed with the state. I kept it. I told myself for 11 years it was just paranoia, just an old junior engineer hoarding paper she was too scared to ever use. I think I always knew, somewhere, that someday somebody would finally come asking the right question." She opened a locked desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila envelope that looked like it had been handled and re-hidden more times than either of us could count. "I drove home from Tacoma that night with Renata's envelope locked in the trunk, and I told myself, the way I'd told myself so many things over the past few weeks, that the worst of it was probably over. I was wrong within 48 hours. My father called me at 4:52 in the morning, his voice tight in a way I'd only heard once before, the night he found the eviction notice. "Someone tried to burn the warehouse," he said. "The excavator's fine. The office isn't. I got there before the fire investigator did. The smell hit me first. Acrid and chemical, nothing like the clean wood smoke of a normal accident. Half the office wall was scorched black. The old filing cabinet where my father kept decades of invoices warped and blistered at the corner nearest the point of origin. Detective Holt Bannerman, a 20-year veteran of the Spokane County Fire Marshal's arson unit, walked the scene with me 2 hours later, flashlight in hand, crouching every few feet to examine the char patterns along the baseboard. This wasn't faulty wiring," Detective Bannerman said, pointing to a distinct ore pattern staining the concrete near the doorway. "Somebody used an accelerant, and whoever did it wanted it to look sloppy and random. Kids, maybe, or a grudge nobody could ever prove. That's usually the point of a fire like this. It doesn't have to convict anybody. It just has to send a message." "What message?" "Stop looking," Detective Bannerman said simply. "That's usually the whole message. We couldn't prove who said it. There was no camera on that side of the building. No witness, no accelerant residue clean enough to trace back to a specific supplier. But the timing wasn't subtle. It happened 4 days after I'd first knocked on Owen Brisbane's door, and 2 days after Renata Okonkwo agreed, over an encrypted email chain, to meet me in person. My hands didn't stop shaking for most of that morning. I didn't tell Renata about the fire until after she'd already handed me the envelope, because I was terrified that if she knew someone was willing to burn a building to keep this buried, she'd change her mind entirely. I told Colonel Ames about the fire 2 weeks later, once the Army's review had formally opened, mostly because Theo insisted the timeline needed to be part of the official record. Colonel Ames didn't say much on the call, which somehow felt more unsettling than if she had. A few days after that, an unmarked sedan began parking, once or twice a week, at the end of our street for a couple of hours at a time. Nobody ever got out. Nobody ever approached the house. When I finally asked General Vance directly whether his office had anything to do with it, he only said, "I don't leave a soldier's family exposed twice in one lifetime, Miss Whitaker," and changed the subject before I could push further. I hired Theodora Lindgren the following week, a civil litigation attorney my father's new accountant recommended after Whitaker Yard Care's sudden flood of business made an accountant, unbelievably, a thing we now needed. Theo had spent 16 years handling wrongful death and construction liability cases across eastern Washington, and she read Renata's original engineering submission twice through before she said a single word. "This is not just a civil liability problem for Langley Civic Development," Theo told me, spreading the documents across her conference table alongside Owen Brisbane's sworn affidavit and Estelle Marsh's decade-old settlement paperwork. "This is a falsified public safety submission tied to a fatality. Depending on how aggressively the county prosecutor wants to pursue it, we are talking about negligent homicide exposure for whoever signed off on the final altered engineering package." And I recognize that signature, Bryn. It's Conrad Langley's. "Can we make it public?" "We can do better than public," Theo said. "Given that a military transport bus was directly endangered by the same structural failure, we can loop in the Army's own safety review process, which General Vance's office is now, conveniently, already primed to take seriously. A parallel military inquiry alongside a state criminal referral is exactly the kind of pressure that makes settlement negotiations disappear." Colonel Patricia Ames, an 18-year Army Corps of Engineers officer working under General Vance's office, called me 3 days later, her voice carrying the specific clipped efficiency of someone used to briefing rooms full of people who didn't want to hear bad news. "General Vance asked me to review the transportation safety failures connected to the incident that nearly cost him his unit 14 years ago," Colonel Ames said. "Based on what your attorney has forwarded, this isn't a closed matter anymore. I'll need Mr. Brisbane's affidavit, Ms. Okonkwo's original submission, and the DOT's contemporaneous inspection logs, if any still exist." They still existed. Owen Brisbane, it turned out, had kept a personal carbon copy of every inspection report he'd ever filed in his career, tucked into a filing cabinet in his garage, a habit he said had started as simple professional pride and ended, unintentionally, as the only insurance policy that mattered. Casper Doyle, an investigative reporter who'd covered infrastructure corruption across the Pacific Northwest for close to a decade, ran the first story 9 days later. Timed to publish the same morning Theo filed our civil complaint, and the county prosecutor's office confirmed it was opening a formal criminal review. The headline named Langley Civic Development directly. It laid out the falsified rebar specifications, Renata Okonkwo's original uncorrupted engineering submission, Owen Brisbane's silenced inspection reports, and Wesley Marsh's death, connecting all of it explicitly to the same storm that had nearly buried a military transport bus my father spent 6 hours digging out of the snow with his bare hands and an old excavator. The story detonated faster than anything that had happened at the wedding itself. Conrad Langley's company had, in the weeks since the Willow Creek Community Hall humiliation, already lost the federal logistics hub contract General Vance killed on the spot. 2 other state infrastructure contracts, already under review following that very public denial, were quietly suspended within 48 hours of Casper's article going live. Langley Civic Development stock, held privately by the family but tracked closely by regional business press since the wedding story first went viral, was reported by 2 separate outlets to have lost roughly 60% of its estimated value in bank valuations used to secure the company's outstanding construction loans. Conrad Langley's lawyers issued a statement calling the allegations a coordinated smear campaign rooted in a broken engagement, not engineering fact. The statement lasted exactly 4 days until the county prosecutor's office confirmed it had obtained Renata Okonkwo's original, unaltered engineering submission through a grand jury subpoena, matched against Owen Brisbane's personal carbon copy inspection logs, both time-stamped independently, both telling the exact same story. In the days after Casper's article ran, 2 other former Langley Civic Development employees reached out to him directly, both describing versions of the same quiet pressure Renata had lived under for a decade. One was a retired project manager who admitted on the record that he'd been instructed more than once to smooth the numbers before they leave the building. The other was a young site inspector who'd resigned only 18 months earlier rather than sign off on a load-bearing calculation he didn't believe. Neither had known about Wesley Marsh. Both said, almost word for word, that they'd always assumed the pressure they felt was ordinary industry ruthlessness, not something that had already cost a man his life once before either of them was ever hired. "I kept telling myself, everyone cuts corners somewhere," the young inspector told Casper, in a quote that ran in the follow-up piece 2 days days later. I didn't know somewhere had already been a mountain pass with a bus full of soldiers on it. I didn't sleep the night Theo called with a 72-hour warning. I sat on the floor of my apartment with my back against the couch, replaying every version of what could still go wrong, my hands moving in small, useless circles over the same page of Renata's engineering submission until the ink started to blur under my own fingerprints. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I called my father, not because there was anything new to tell him, but because I needed to hear his voice, steady in a way mine wasn't anymore. "You're not the one who has to fix this alone," he told me, half asleep, his voice rough with a particular exhaustion of a man who still got up at 5 to run a yard crew, regardless of what his daughter was fighting in courtrooms and diner booths. "You never were. Not at the wedding. Not now." I had less than 72 hours, Theo told me, before Langley's legal team was scheduled to attempt an emergency settlement offer directly to Estelle Marsh, structured, according to a source inside the county clerk's office, specifically to include a non-disclosure clause broad enough to also bury any further cooperation with a criminal referral. "If Estelle signs before the grand jury hearing," Theo said, sitting across from me in her office at 11 at night, "her testimony disappears from the criminal case entirely. Civil settlements can't force silence in front of a grand jury, but a scared widow offered a life-changing amount of money by a team of expensive lawyers doesn't always know that, and Langley's people are counting on exactly that confusion." I drove to Estelle's house that same night. She was sitting at her kitchen table with an unsigned settlement offer in front of her, an amount of money large enough to erase every financial hardship the last 14 years had handed her, and a look on her face that told me she'd already been sitting there a long time trying to decide what her husband would have wanted her to do with it. "They offered me $800,000, Estelle said quietly, "to stop talking to a reporter I've already talked to 3 times. You don't have to sign anything," I said, "but if you do, I need you to understand what it takes with it." She looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw exactly what 14 years of swallowed grief looks like on a person's face. "Wesley used to say the mountain doesn't lie," Estelle said. "It just tells you the truth in the worst possible way, at the worst possible time. I think I've spent 14 years letting other people tell me a softer version of that truth because it was easier to survive on. I don't want easier anymore." She didn't sign. She testified in front of the grand jury 4 days later, describing in a steady, unhurried voice exactly what her husband's supervisor had told her the morning after his death, and exactly what a terrified junior engineer named Renata Okonkwo had confessed to her, sobbing, 6 years later. The grand jury returned an indictment against Conrad Langley 11 days after that, on charges of criminal negligent homicide tied to Wesley Marsh's death, alongside separate charges of falsifying public safety records. Trevor was never charged criminally. The prosecutor's office found no evidence he'd known anything about the barrier failure itself, only that he'd inherited, and gladly worn, the arrogance built on top of it. That distinction, small as it was, didn't save what remained of his reputation. No employer in the Pacific Northwest construction industry would touch a Langley after that spring, regardless of which one they were. I sat in the gallery on the day Conrad Langley was arraigned, the same charcoal gray courtroom light falling across a man who'd once told my father he was nothing more than dirt beneath a good family's boots. He didn't look at me. He looked instead at General Arthur Vance, who had traveled back from the Pentagon specifically to sit in the second row that morning, in full dress uniform, a silent, immovable reminder of exactly which mountain this had all started on. Yvette Langley wasn't in the courtroom that day, or any day of the trial that followed. Casper Doyle later confirmed, in a short follow-up item, that she'd quietly filed for divorce the same week the grand jury indictment became public record, and moved to her sister's condominium in Boise under her maiden name. I felt nothing when I read it. Not satisfaction, not pity, just the flat, tired recognition of a woman finally doing, 14 years too late, what my father had once been forced to do at the front of an emptying community hall. The trial itself lasted 11 days. Owen Brisbane testified first, walking the jury through his original inspection notes line by line, his voice steady until the prosecutor asked him why he'd signed the separation agreement instead of fighting back 14 years earlier. "Because I had a mortgage and a daughter starting college," he said, "and because I told myself the mountain would never test that barrier twice in one lifetime. I was wrong, and Wesley Marsh paid for being wrong for me." Renata Okonkwo testified the following afternoon, laying the 2 engineering submissions side by side on a courtroom projector so the jury could see in Conrad Langley's own handwriting the exact line where the real rebar specification had been crossed out and replaced with a smaller number. The defense argued for 11 days that a barrier's failure under an unprecedented storm didn't prove intent, only misfortune. The prosecution's closing argument dismantled that theory in under 20 minutes, ending on a single line the local paper printed above the fold the next morning. "Misfortune doesn't come with 2 engineering submissions and a shredded original. Fraud does." The jury deliberated for barely 6 hours. Conrad Langley was convicted on all counts and stood perfectly straight, the way my father once had at his own altar, as the verdict was read. He received a 12-year sentence, weighted heavily by what the judge called, reading almost verbatim from a phrase Casper Doyle's reporting had made famous, a documented, decade-long pattern of choosing profit margins over the lives of the people the defendant was legally and morally obligated to protect. Langley Civic Development was formally dissolved 11 weeks later, its remaining state contracts reassigned, its name stripped from 3 separate buildings across Spokane and Seattle that had once proudly worn it. it. Renata Okonkwo testified at the trial, and afterward, at Theo's quiet recommendation, was hired as a compliance auditor for the very State Department that had once let her original engineering submission disappear into someone else's revision. Owen Brisbane received, 11 months after his front porch confession to a stranger who'd once nearly married into the family that ruined his career, a formal, if quiet, letter of reinstatement and apology from the Washington State Department of Transportation. He framed it. He hung it 2 inches from his old retirement plaque. Estelle Marsh used a portion of the eventual civil settlement, far smaller than Langley's silence money, but attached to no conditions at all, to establish a small scholarship fund in Wesley's name for children of state highway workers. She invited my father to the first scholarship ceremony. He went. He didn't say much. He never does. But he shook every recipient's hand himself, and I watched him hold each one a half-second longer than necessary, like he was trying to make up, in small increments, for 6 hours on a mountain that had cost one family everything, while sparing another almost by accident. General Vance made good on something else, too. Something he'd apparently been quietly arranging through Colonel Ames's office since the week of the wedding itself. 11 months after Conrad Langley's arraignment, my father was formally awarded the Army's Outstanding Civilian Service Medal at a modest ceremony at Joint Base Lewis McChord, the same medal the state had once tried to press on him 14 years earlier, and that he'd quietly, stubbornly refused to accept. He didn't refuse it this time. I think by then, he finally understood that accepting it wasn't about pride. It was about making sure Wesley Marsh's name got read out loud, in the same ceremony, in front of people with the power to make sure nobody ever quietly buried a story like this again. I stood beside my father that day, in a modest navy dress instead of a wedding gown, watching General Vance pin a medal onto a suit jacket that wasn't pawned this time, purchased instead with money my father had finally, rightfully, stopped needing to hide. 14 years is a long time to carry something alone, General Vance told him quietly, before the applause even started. It was worth it, my father said, as long as somebody was still around at the end of it to hear the truth. Trevor sent me a single text message the week Conrad's verdict was announced, the first I'd heard from him since the phone call, warning me to let everything go. It read only, I didn't know. I never checked to make sure it was true, and I never answered. Some silences say more than any reply could. I still have the tin box. It sits on the mantel in the newly renovated Whitaker Yard Care office, dented, rusted at the corners, exactly the way it looked the moment it hit the hardwood floor of the Willow Creek Community Hall. I never had it repaired. I like it better broken. It reminds me that some things only reveal what they're really made of once somebody finally knocks them out of your hands.